Hello and welcome. We are continuing to read Ranger in Time, Night of Soldiers and Spies. This is Chapter 13, No Turning Back. Chapter 13 Vocabulary. Number 1, barely, only just, almost not. Number 2, massacre, an indiscriminate and brutal slaughter of people. Number 3, brisk, active, fast, and energetic. Number 4, collapsed, of a person having fallen down and become unconscious. Number 5, trance, a half-conscious state characterized by an absence of response to external stimuli. And number 6, frigid, very cold in temperature. If you open your books to page 91, we'll continue reading Ranger in Time, Night of Soldiers and Spies, Chapter 13, No Turning Back. Isaac wrapped his wool blanket around his shoulders. He stood by the fire for a few minutes, but barely had time to warm up. Already his blanket was crusted with ice. It was 4 in the morning, more than 3 hours later than they'd planned to set out from the river. There was no hope of arriving in darkness now. They'd march into Trenton in full daylight. If the Hessians got word of their approach, it would be a massacre. The orders had been made clear from the first step. March at a brisk pace. Wrap blankets around the muskets to keep the firing mechanisms dry. And no man was allowed to leave. Anyone who tried would face instant punishment. It was 9 miles to Trenton. Isaac and the others marched up the bank from the river. The road was icy and rutted as it wound through the dark woods. Isaac wished the night could last longer to hide their approach. Once dawn arrived, how could the Hessians miss a mile-long column of men? When they reached the crossroad at Bear Tavern, the troops turned. The road was still slick, but it was level, and they began to make better time. The storm wasn't blowing right in their faces anymore, but no matter how tightly he pulled the blanket around him, Isaac couldn't get warm. It was getting harder and harder to keep up. Joe had already stayed back to help a man who was injured. Before long, the whole line of men came to a halt. Isaac found himself staring down into one of the ravines he'd seen when he made his journey before. A rocky creek bed stretched out 100 feet below the road. Crossing it would cost them more time. But thanks to the information Isaac had brought back from his spy mission, the officers had a plan. One by one, men unharnessed the horses and prepared their artillery. Isaac helped them attach drag ropes to the trees. The men used these to lower cannons to the bottom of the ravine and haul them up on the other side. Time seemed to stand still as the snow and ice swirled, but finally they made it across. The clock hadn't stopped, though. It would be light long before they made it to Trenton. They'd marched only a short way when they came to the second ravine, smaller and steeper than the first. It slowed them down even more. Finally, they set out on the road again, wide open to the wind and snow. Ranger nudged Isaac whenever he slowed down. All around them, soldiers were shivering and dragging their feet. One man quietly slipped out of line, stumbled off the road, and collapsed. Ranger started toward him, but Isaac grabbed his collar. "Stay, dog." Ranger barked. Hadn't Isaac seen the man fall? Hadn't anyone? The line of men just kept marching in a tired trance. As soon as Isaac let go, Ranger broke away and ran to the man by the side of the road. Ranger nuzzled his hand, but he didn't move. Ranger barked. The man didn't respond. By then, all the troops had marched on by. Ranger ran ahead to the soldiers and jumped up on one of them. Down. The man swatted him away, but Ranger kept barking. He went back and forth from the man in the snow to the troops. That was what you did when someone was in trouble, and you needed to bring help. Ranger had practice in his training with Luke and Dad. He'd followed Luke's scent to wherever he was hiding in the woods, pretending to be lost and hurt. When he found Luke, he'd bark to give the alert. But sometimes that wasn't enough. When you were a search and rescue dog, sometimes you had to leave the person you found and go get a helper. Then you brought them back to the person who was hurt or sick. The man in the snow was in trouble, so Ranger kept running back and forth. Finally, an officer stopped. "That dog has found something," he said. He pointed down the road and ordered two of his men, "Follow him and make sure it's not a Hessian spy." Ranger led the men to the soldier who had fallen. He was covered in snow, nearly hidden. Ranger pawed at the man's shoulder. The soldiers hurried to the man's side and wrapped him in their blankets. When he began to stir, they helped him stand and loaded him onto one of their horses to ride back to the troops. Ranger didn't wait for anyone to pat him on the head or tell him what a good dog he was. At home, when Ranger trained with Luke and Dad, he got ear scratches and hugs when he'd done a good job. But this icy road was a long way from home. Ranger didn't even know where his first aid kit was, but he knew his work wasn't done. Ranger raced up to find Isaac. He fell into step behind him and licked his cold fingers. Isaac looked down, but all he could do was sigh and lay his hand on the dog's ice-crusted head. It felt as if this frigid death march would never end. Finally, they stopped at another crossroads. Here, the officers explained they would split into two groups and take two different roads into Trenton. The plan was to surround the town and attack while the Hessians were still sleeping. Isaac wondered if their weapons would even work. The men had sent word up to the front of the column, warning General Washington that the guns might be too wet to fire by the time they arrived. Word came back from Washington almost immediately. His order was clear: advance and charge. Whether the guns worked or not, they were going. There would be no turning back. Chapter 13, Comprehension Questions. What were three things that made the march from the banks of the Delaware River to Trenton, New Jersey so challenging for George Washington and his troops, including Isaac? Sample answer. Three things that made the march from the banks of the Delaware River to Trenton, New Jersey so challenging for George Washington and his troops were the snow, the cold wind, and two steep ravines they had to get their cannons across. Question 2. If you had been one of George Washington's troops, what part of this march to Trenton would have been the most difficult for you to deal with? Why? Sample answer. If I had been one of George Washington's troops, the most difficult part of this march to Trenton to deal with would have been the cold. As a soldier, I would not have had good boots, pants, gloves, or a jacket to keep me from getting frostbite. This would have made me less effective as a soldier. I would also have had a hard time with the fact that the attack was running late. By running late, Washington and his troops risked losing the element of surprise. And this takes us to Chapter 14.